Ada was always the kind of person who made you believe in possibilities. Even when life threw dirt at her, she'd laugh it off and say, "It go better." That's the Ada I knew. The Ada I admired. But the woman sitting on my living room floor, clutching her knees to her chest, wasn't that person anymore. She looked broken, her vibrant glow replaced by shadows. "You gave up your womb," I repeated, still struggling to process it. "I didn't think it would matter," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, as though even the words were too heavy for her to carry. "He said we'd have everything. That nothing else would matter if we had money." I leaned forward, trying to catch her eyes. "But Ada, children, your future. How could you? You think I don't know what I've done," she snapped, her voice cracking like glass. "You think I don't wake up every day wishing I could go back?" She buried her face in her hands, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was her muffled sobs. 2 years ago. The first time Ada mentioned Dele to me, she was all smiles. We were sitting in her tiny one-bedroom apartment in Suralere, sharing a plate of jollof rice and fried fish. "Amoka, this one is different," she said, her eyes lighting up. "He's not like those Lagos guys that just want to flex. Dele has a vision. He's going places." I raised an eyebrow. "Vision doesn't pay rent, Ada." She laughed. "I know, but he's working on it. He's just stuck right now. I believe in him." Looking back, I wish I'd told her to be careful. But back then, who was I to judge? Ada and Dele seemed genuinely in love, and for a while, it looked like they were building something real. Dele was always polite when I met him. He had that charm some men carry effortlessly, the kind that made you want to trust him, even if you knew better. But there were signs, little things that didn't sit right with me. Like how he'd get agitated whenever Ada talked about their future. "We'll figure it out," he'd say, brushing her off. "Just trust me." And Ada always did. The first time Dele mentioned the baba, Ada was skeptical. "You want me to drink what?" she asked, staring at him like he'd lost his mind. "It's not like that," Dele insisted, pacing the room. "It's just a small thing. A spiritual connection." The baba said it's harmless. "Harmless? You're talking about sacrifices, Dele. This isn't harmless." Dele knelt in front of her, grabbing her hands. "Ada, please. This is our chance. Do you want to keep struggling like this forever? Living paycheck to paycheck, hoping things will get better? I'm doing this for us." "For us," she said, pulling her hands away. "Or for you?" Dele didn't answer. He just looked at her with those pleading eyes that Ada could never resist. Dele's words had sunk deep into Ada's heart, pulling at something she couldn't explain. It was that desperate, knowing feeling that she'd had for months, that nothing was ever going to change unless she made a sacrifice of her own. They had been struggling for years, living paycheck to paycheck, and she was tired of pretending that it would all work out in the end. That night, after Dele left, Ada sat by the window, staring out at the Lagos skyline. The city was alive with lights, but in her heart, she felt nothing but darkness. She thought about their small apartment, the days she'd skipped meals to buy him another shirt for an interview, the constant fight to make ends meet. She remembered the early days of their relationship, when everything had seemed so full of promise. Dele had told her stories about the Baba in Abuja, about how he had helped a few lucky people rise from nothing to unimaginable wealth. Ada had always laughed it off. But now, in the silence of her apartment, with nothing but her thoughts and Dele's pleading face echoing in her mind, she found herself questioning everything. What if this was their only shot? What if the Baba could actually change their lives? Ada picked up her phone and dialed Dele's number. "I'm in," she whispered when he picked up. The trip to Abuja felt like a blur. Ada didn't know exactly what she was expecting, but she certainly didn't anticipate the overwhelming sense of dread that began to settle in her chest the moment they arrived at the Bobo shrine. It was tucked away in a remote village, far from the glittering streets of the capital. The road was bumpy, the air thick with humidity, and the surroundings were eerily quiet. Ada felt uneasy, but Dele was practically vibrating with excitement. He could barely sit still, his eyes shining with something that was almost feverish. "We are almost there," he said, gripping her hand tightly. "Just trust me, Ada. This is going to change everything." The Boba's house was a small, dimly lit structure surrounded by tall trees. It had an odd, mystical feel to it. Everything about it felt wrong, but Ada couldn't bring herself to speak. The Boba was an old man, his face deeply wrinkled, his eyes sharp and unsettling. He didn't greet them with the warmth Ada had expected, but instead, he looked at them as if sizing them up, measuring them against something unknown. After a few moments of silence, he spoke. "Your sacrifice will not be easy, but it will be necessary," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "You will offer what is most precious to you, your womb." Ada froze. "My womb," she whispered. "What do you mean?" The Boba's eyes glinted. "What is a woman's true wealth if not the ability to bring life into the world? But to gain wealth, you must be willing to let go of what you hold dear. You cannot have both. You will be blessed with riches, but you will never bear children. Not in this life." Dele's voice broke through Ada's shock. "It's just for a little while. Just until we're rich, and then we can do whatever we want. Don't you want that?" Ada didn't know what to say. The Boba's words were too much to process. The price of a future. The price of Dele's dream. "I'll do it," Ada said, her voice shaking. The days after the ritual were strange. Ada didn't immediately notice anything different, but as time went on, small things started to change. Her period stopped. At first, she told herself it was just a fluke. But then, when she saw a doctor and was told the devastating truth, that she could no longer have children, she realized what the Boba's words had truly meant. She cried. She screamed. But what could she do now? Dele had promised her that everything would be worth it. And at first, it seemed like he was right. His business deals began to skyrocket. He started pulling in millions, signing contracts that were beyond anything they'd ever imagined. They moved into a luxurious apartment in Banana Island. He bought her things she never dreamed of, designer bags, jewelry, a brand new car. Ada felt like she was living in a dream. But even as Dele's wealth grew, something in him began to change. He grew colder, more distant. He was no longer the loving man who held her hand and promised her the world. He became obsessed with his power. He started taking long business trips, and Ada began to notice the little things, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the whispers. One day, she saw him laughing with a woman in the lobby of their building. A woman who wasn't her. It didn't take long for Ada to realize that Dele had changed for good. "I don't understand, Dele," she said one evening, as they sat in their expansive living room. "You promised me we'd be in this together. Now you're barely home, and when you are, you barely talk to me." Dele sighed, glancing at her with a mixture of annoyance and impatience. "Ada, I'm busy. You knew what you were signing up for. The money's rolling in, but I have to work harder than ever to keep it." She shook her head. "It's not just the work. It's like you don't care about me anymore." He stood up, walking toward the window. "You're still here, aren't you? What more do you want?" Ada's heart sank. "You don't love me anymore, do you?" Dele didn't answer. Instead, he turned to her, his face hard. "I need a woman who can give me more than just her body. I need someone who can give me a future, a real future." Not someone who can't even have children. Her stomach twisted. The words cut deeper than anything else he had ever said. That night, after Dele left for another one of his business trips, Ada collapsed on their bed, sobbing. She couldn't believe it. After everything, after the sacrifice, Dele was planning to leave her for someone else. A woman who could give him what Ada could not, children. Days passed. Ada stayed in the apartment, a shell of the woman she once was. She could feel her anger simmering beneath the surface, but she wasn't sure what to do with it. Revenge. It seemed too much like something out of a movie, but at the same time, something deep inside her whispered that Dele deserved to feel the same pain he had caused her. Then, a text from Amoka broke the silence. Ada, did you hear? Dele married someone else. She's young, beautiful, and, get this, she's pregnant. Can you believe it? Ada stared at the screen for a moment, her heart hammering in her chest. Pregnant. She dropped the phone and walked to the balcony, her hands shaking. What had she done? What was the price of her choice? The weeks that followed were a blur. Ada's world felt like it had shrunk to the size of a matchbox, and every movement she made felt like she was dragging a weight behind her. She had no idea what to do anymore. Dele was gone, his promises of wealth and love nothing more than a cruel joke. And now, she learned he was married to someone else, someone who could do what Ada could never do, bear him children. The thought of it gnawed at her. Dele had never been the most faithful man, but this was a betrayal like no other. He had cast her aside for a younger, fertile woman who could give him everything Ada could no longer provide. For a moment, Ada entertained the thought of confronting him, of demanding an explanation. But what was the point? What could she possibly say to make him understand the depth of her sacrifice? One night, unable to sleep, she found herself sitting on the balcony of their luxurious apartment, staring out at the sparkling lights of Banana Island. The city looked beautiful from this height, but all she saw was emptiness. All she felt was loss. I did this for him, she whispered to herself, the words barely escaping her lips. And now, he's gone. But even as she spoke, a voice, soft but insistent, whispered from somewhere deep inside her. You can't let him get away with this. He has to pay. Ada jolted upright, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around, confused. Who had said that? The air felt thick, heavy. The city seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. It was as though the universe itself was listening, waiting for her next move. It was a week later when Ada found herself at the Boba's shrine again. She had called him, desperate, with no plan, only a burning desire to regain control of her life. The Boba had agreed to meet her, and now, as she walked into the dimly lit space, her heart pounded in her chest. The Boba was sitting on a low stool, his eyes closed as if he had been expecting her. Ada stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure whether she was making the right choice. She had already given so much, but now, the anger inside her was unbearable. She wanted Dele to feel what she had felt. She wanted him to understand the price of his betrayal. The Boba opened his eyes slowly, as though he had been waiting for her to come. You are back, my child, he said, his voice low and knowing. What is it you seek this time? Ada didn't hesitate. I want revenge, she said, her voice hard, the words like poison on her tongue. I want him to pay for what he did to me. I want him to feel everything I felt. The Boba studied her for a long moment, his piercing gaze reading her soul. Revenge is a dangerous thing, child, he said quietly. It always comes at a price, and the cost can be more than you are willing to bear. I don't care, Ada replied. He destroyed me. Now I want to destroy him. The Boba nodded slowly. Very well. But remember, once the path is chosen, there is no turning back. Meanwhile, Dele's life seemed to be moving forward without a hitch. His new wife, Chika, had given him everything he had wanted: a fresh start, a fertile woman, and, soon, children. They were living in an even larger house, one that surpassed the opulence of their previous home. Dele's business empire was expanding, and for the first time, it seemed like everything was falling into place. But there was something in Dele that wasn't satisfied. The money, the fame, the beautiful wife, none of it filled the emptiness that had settled in his heart since the day he left Ada. He didn't talk about it, didn't even acknowledge it, but it was there, lurking in the corners of his mind. Ada had been a part of his rise to success, and as much as he tried to push it away, he knew he couldn't forget her completely. One evening, as he sat alone in his new home, sipping on a glass of whiskey, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You took everything from her. Now, it's time for you to pay the price. You can't escape what you've done." Dele frowned, staring at the message. He knew who it was from, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. Ada was out of his life now, wasn't she? But still, there was something unsettling about the message. Something that felt off. He shook it off, dismissing it as the work of an overzealous ex. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. He'd wake up to find his car keys missing. His meetings would get cancelled at the last minute. His business deals, once smooth, began to falter. Clients pulled out of deals without explanation. And then, one night, as he walked into his bedroom, he saw her. Ada was standing by the window, her back to him, staring out at the city. She was dressed in black, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Dele froze in shock. "How did you?" But before he could say another word, Ada turned around. Her eyes were cold, empty. There was something about her that seemed wrong. Like she wasn't the Ada he used to know. "Did you really think you could escape me, Dele?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the quiet room. Dele stumbled backward, his heart racing. "Ada, what is this? What do you want from me?" "I want you to suffer," she said, taking a slow step toward him. "I want you to feel what I felt. The emptiness. The betrayal. The pain of knowing you gave up everything for a dream, only to have that dream turn into a nightmare." Dele's blood ran cold. "What did you do?" The following days were a blur of strange occurrences. Dele's world seemed to crumble around him. Business deals fell apart, his relationships with clients soured, and worst of all, he began to lose control of his own mind. It was as though something was inside him, gnawing at his thoughts, pulling him deeper into madness. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to confront Ada. He needed to know what she had done to him. He drove to the apartment they had shared, but when he arrived, something felt wrong. The door was slightly ajar, and as he stepped inside, he found the place empty. Silent. But on the table, there was a note. "You wanted children. Now, you will have nothing. Not even peace." The days after Dele read the note were a blur of panic and fear. Every corner of his life seemed to be falling apart, like a house of cards being blown away by an invisible wind. He couldn't make sense of it. His business empire, the very thing he had sacrificed everything for, was beginning to crumble. Clients were pulling out, investments were vanishing, and even his marriage with Chika began to show cracks. Chika had been everything he wanted in the beginning: young, beautiful, and, most importantly, able to give him children. But now, she looked at him with the same cold, distant eyes that had started to invade his own reflection. The happiness he had imagined felt hollow, like a shell of a dream that he couldn't even reach. That night, after a particularly brutal business call, Dele sat in his study, his face buried in his hands. He had thought that he could escape Ada's shadow, but it seemed she was everywhere now, haunting him. The strange messages. The unexplained occurrences. The constant feeling of being watched. He felt it, her presence, just as clearly as if she were standing beside him. It was as if she were in his very thoughts, manipulating them, twisting them into something darker, something more dangerous. The phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. You thought you could break me. But you are the one who is broken now. Dele's hands shook as he read the text. He slammed the phone down on the desk, frustration and fear bubbling up inside him. He didn't know what was happening anymore, but one thing was certain: Ada was behind it. And she wasn't going to let him off easily. Meanwhile, Ada's life was taking on a different form. She had returned to her small apartment in Surale, the one she had lived in before all the wealth and power. It felt strangely comforting, despite everything that had happened. The apartment was quiet now, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of her past life. But peace was fleeting. Ada couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. She had exacted her revenge, but the satisfaction she had once imagined was now nothing but a bitter taste in her mouth. The emptiness was still there. She had taken Dele's wealth, his happiness, his future, but in return, she had lost something far greater: herself. She tried to move on, to rebuild her life, but the shadow of her past lingered like a heavy fog. She started to have strange dreams, dreams of Dele, of the Baba, of her own womb. In each dream, she was running from something she couldn't see but could feel close behind her, breathing down her neck. The dreams were haunting, vivid, and they felt like a warning. One night, after a particularly disturbing dream, Ada woke up in a cold sweat. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the dark corners of her room, feeling the weight of something unspeakable pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just regret. It wasn't just guilt. It was something far worse. The price she had paid for revenge had already taken its toll, and Ada realized, with a sinking heart, that she had made a grave mistake. The following day, Ada couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled inside her. She hadn't heard from the Baba since the ritual, but now, as the sun set and the streets of Lagos grew quieter, she felt an undeniable pull, a call, like the faint echo of something ancient. She had to see him again. She didn't even think twice. Her mind was consumed by the need for answers. What had the Baba truly done to her? What was the cost of her sacrifice? And, most importantly, how could she undo it? Ada made her way to the shrine in the outskirts of Lagos, the place where she had first encountered the Baba. As she stepped inside, the heavy air seemed to close around her. The Baba was sitting in the same place, his eyes closed, as though he had been expecting her. "You've come," he said, his voice low, like a rumble of thunder in the distance. "I don't understand," Ada said, her voice trembling. "I did everything you asked. I gave up everything. But now, I feel like I'm losing my mind. I can't escape what I've done. The guilt is eating me alive." The Baba opened his eyes slowly, locking them with hers. "You wanted power, wealth, and revenge. You wanted to destroy Dele. But child, you have not destroyed him. You have destroyed yourself. You have given up what is most precious to you, the very essence of who you are. And that, my child, is something that cannot be undone." Ada's heart dropped. "What do you mean? What can't be undone?" "The sacrifice you made," the Baba said, his voice grim. "It was not just your womb that you gave. It was your soul. And now you must live with the consequences." Ada shook her head, confusion mixing with fear. No, this can't be true. I didn't." The Baba raised a hand, silencing her. "You thought you could gain everything, but you failed to understand the true cost. Your womb may have been taken, but something far worse has been stripped from you. The very thing that makes you human. You may never find peace again." Back in Dele's world, Things were rapidly spinning out of control. His empire was on the verge of collapse. It wasn't just business failures or bad luck. It was as though some invisible force was conspiring against him. The once vibrant man he had been, the man full of ambition and dreams, was now a shell of himself. Everywhere he went, he saw Ada's face. He heard her voice in the whispers of the wind. He felt her presence in every corner of his life. At first, he thought he was imagining things. But then, it became impossible to deny. One day, Dele collapsed during a board meeting, his heart racing, his body drenched in sweat. He was rushed to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. His body was fine, but his mind was deteriorating. He knew it was Ada. He had been cursed. The price of his betrayal, the price of what he had done, was finally coming due. The night that Dele's mind finally broke was the same night Ada stood at the threshold of his new mansion, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come to finish what she started. She had come to see the end of him, to ensure that he felt the depth of her sacrifice. But when she stepped inside, it wasn't the victorious, vengeful feeling she had imagined. It was something else. Something darker. Something irreversible. Dele was sitting in a chair in the center of the room, his eyes wild and vacant. He looked at her as if he hadn't seen her in years. His lips trembled, barely able to form words. "Ada, please," he whispered, his voice cracked and desperate. "What have you done to me?" Ada stepped closer, but as she did, something inside her faltered. The weight of everything she had done, everything she had sacrificed, hit her all at once. Was this the victory she had wanted? Was this the peace she had dreamed of? Her hands shook as she reached out to touch him, but before she could, a loud crack echoed through the room. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. In that moment, Ada realized the truth. The price wasn't just her womb. It was her very soul.